This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is addiction. Is it a disease or is it not? I have an expert on this topic, and this conversation will begin in a moment. Stephen Slate is my guest. He has a website called the Clean Slate Addiction Site. And as I like to usually do, I like to give my guests a few minutes to give a little background about themselves. So, Stephen, if you could tell me who you are, how you came to the opinions that you have about addiction, and a little bit about your website.
Yeah, so I used to have a problem with drug use when I was a kid. I started in my late teens, and for a few years there, I used a lot of drugs. It wasn't necessarily a problem. It was more like kid partying hard in that hard partying phase, I guess. It got to where I had a girlfriend fighting with me about it. I had family concerned, and they did a little bit of an intervention with me. And they took me to, they asked me, and it wasn't one of those big formal interventions. It was just a few relatives and her sat down and said, "We think you need to get help. Go see a counselor." So I went to a counselor, and one of the drugs I've been using was heroin, and I was using that nasally, intermittently, on and off, here and there, sometimes daily, sometimes not. And I was telling the counselor what was going on with me, and I told him about a recent period where I stopped doing it for 3 months. Sort of on a trial basis, because there was talk that one of the friends that I did it with was addicted. He was stealing from his roommates, doing things like that. And I was like, what is that? Addicted? What does that mean? Am I addicted? And to me, that meant you can't stop. So I just decided to see if I could stop, whatever that meant, even though I had been stopping and starting it already. Let me formally do this, and I stopped doing it for about 3 months. And now I'm telling this counselor these things. It was just an outpatient counselor in a little office in Philadelphia. And he said, "No, you didn't. You didn't stop." And I said, "Well, I did, and I started using again about a month ago or whatever it was at the time, and I use it quite a bit. I like it." And he said, no, you couldn't have quit doing heroin on your own. That's impossible. Nobody can quit heroin. It's a highly addictive drug. You can only quit with treatment. You can't quit on your own. I'm like, well, I did. And it became this big argument back and forth, which ended, and he was pulling out a book and saying, "Hey, this is a disease." It flips open to the book, tells me, "Here you go, it's a disease. You have denial. That's part of the disease. You're making up this idea that you quit for a few months when you really didn't, and you are addicted. You can't stop. You need treatment. Blah blah blah." And I still argued the point. He said, "No, I do this when I want to. I don't do it when I don't want to. I can stop it if I want, and I don't want to right now, though." And it sounds kind of crazy, but that's what most young people go through in their first interaction with a drug counselor, is the drug counselor insisting that they agree that they are not in control of their own behavior. Finally, he said, "Well, you could have quit on your own if you were doing fake heroin the whole time. And that's the only way." And so this ended in an explosion of screaming, and I left the office early, and I never went back to him. And somewhere like 6 months down the line, I had a drug arrest, and I had to go to rehab. And then I was there, so I was inpatient for a while, and there I was fully steeped in all of the disease stuff. I have people telling me, you're going to be fighting this for the rest of your life. Oh, it's so horrible. You can't quit. And some people tell me, you're going to be shooting up, because I used it nasally up to that point, on and off for 3 years. They said, you're going to be shooting up. Everybody does. And this wave of defeatism came over me, or fatalism, or whatever you want to call it. And I started to believe I was going to be seen as a junkie for the rest of my life. And I started to believe a little bit some of these things that they told me. Got out within a week. I was shooting up, just as they predicted. And I was fully fulfilling the junkie stereotype in all the other ways that they predicted. I began stealing to satisfy my habit. I could no longer tolerate withdrawal, which I've gone through many times before, but now became completely unbearable as they explained it to me. And so I saw myself get 10 times worse. And over the next 5 years, I lived out that stereotype. I went in and out of different treatments like methadone, outpatient. I got psychiatry, medication for anxiety disorders, depression, bipolar, these things. And my parents wanted me to go do something again. And I said, don't waste your money. It has to be something totally different. Like I'm going to go, and these people are going to tell me I have a disease, but I need to pray and hope for a miracle. And I'm still going to want to do it, and I'm eventually going to crack and do it again. And so they did find a place that said, we don't think addiction is a disease. We think it's a choice. People do it because they want to, because it makes them happy, but they can change that. That's where I went. It was called the St. Jude Retreats at the time. It's now called the Freedom Model Retreats. And I took to their method, which was basically just to approach this as you are fully freely doing it. You can choose to change if you believe you can be happier making a change. I know that's simplistic. And obviously, that was a 6-week program. It gets explained in more ways than that. You go more in depth. But that's what it amounts to in principle at the end of the day, is when a drug user figures out, this is not going to make me feel so good anymore. The benefits are wearing thin, and there is the potential for me to be happier without it. When you genuinely believe that, it's easy to quit. It really is, and it was. I've never craved a day in my life now in 16 years for heroin or any other kind of rampant drug use. I did, after about 4 or 5 years, decide that I was going to drink moderately, and that hasn't been a problem. It hasn't led me back to heroin, for damn sure. And so I was just fascinated with the fact that it was so hard. I was struggling so hard for those 5 years. And then with a slightly different approach, it was simple. And I rapidly quit. I didn't have to do, I don't go to meetings or anything like that. There's nothing I do on any daily basis to stay sober, to make sure I don't relapse or anything like that. It really is. That was a period of my life, and then it started a new stage of my life.
Well, Stephen, let me ask you, did you have any withdrawal symptoms?
Oh, yeah, definitely. But, with heroin withdrawal, it is, 3 days is the worst of it, and maybe 7 days, maybe up to 7 days, because you're beating your body up real good. But after the third day, the withdrawal gets easier and easier, and you're done with it in about a week.
Mm-hmm.
It is not life-threatening. The only cases in which heroin withdrawal is life-threatening are very few cases, and that's when somebody has a whole bunch of other health problems going on, and they're already sort of on the edge of death. Like you might hear the story of Billie Holiday, and they took her off her methadone, and she died in the hospital. But she was sick in so many other ways, and that's why the withdrawal sort of helped her along. But it's withdrawal is so tolerable that people come out of hospitals um, as dependent on morphine or similar opioids after surgery, um, as dependent as a street heroin user, or even more so, all the time. Millions of people. And they go through withdrawal and they don't even know it. They just feel like they're sick. Mm-hmm. Nobody taught them to connect that withdrawal to the idea that you need more drugs. They see themselves as recuperating from the surgery still, and so it just feels like what it is, which physically is like the flu.
Well, let me ask you something. When I was a boy, I was born in 1965, in the early 70s, at the end of the flower power era. A lot of New York City was burnt out. I don't know how old you are, but if you look at pictures from the 1970s, it looked like war-torn Beirut, and there were what were called heroin galleries there. And as a young boy, me and my friends would often go and play in these galleries, and we'd see these people just laying around with large sores on their arms, and they looked like a combination between lepers and AIDS victims now. These people that get to that state, and I'm assuming that you didn't have lesions on your body or whatnot.
I was lucky I had no lesions.
Yeah. What do you would your background say that these are people that at some reason just chose then to continue in this behavior that's so obviously deleterious to them?
Yeah, I think they are choosing on some level, but it's like you don't just choose to all of a sudden move to a shooting gallery and become that, right? Mm-hmm. Like that's not the suggestion. But you get to a point where you believe that's kind of the best that you can do. And so you continue to do it. And like any habit, at a certain point you're not consciously choosing and thinking, well, this is the best I can do with my life. You're not thinking that every day. You're just getting up and going about what you've been habitually doing. Yet at any moment, and that's all free behavior, even if it's not thought out much. Because it's like any routine or habit that you get into, where you start repeating it without thinking much. But you're still motivated to do it because it's what you like and it's what you see as the best thing you can do. And at any given moment, when people make up in some way and figure out that that's not feeling as good as it used to, and there is the potential to feel better with change, then they can and will change. And most people do. If you look at the Vietnam veterans who were addicted to heroin, only 12% of them relapsed with the first year or 3 years that they were back, that is, first 3 years. And then in the long run, 86% of them were completely over their heroin problems. And that's a 24-year follow-up.
Well, let me ask you, Stephen, let me, before we get to the idea of addiction as a disease, I want to throw out a couple of other things. Do you believe that there is an addictive personality type then? For example, my brother-in-law, my wife's husband, who's a couple of years younger than me, when he was in his teens and then early to mid-20s, first he was an alcoholic. Then he dropped alcohol and he became a religious revivalist, a fundamentalist for a few years. He went back to doing alcohol after a short prison stint because of his alcoholism, things that happened because of that. When he came out, he, as far as I know, has never touched alcohol since, but he then became an avid weightlifter to the point of, becoming a Hulk. He seems to be the quintessential kind of addictive personality, be it religion or alcohol or weightlifting or whatnot. So do you think that there are personality types that are addictive if it's not a disease?
A lot of the experts who looked at this have said that there's not really any, if you look across the whole range of people we call addicts and alcoholics, there is no consistent personality type. But I get what you're saying, and I think some people do things to the extreme, right? If they're in, they're all in on something, and sometimes that gets channeled into things that society deems to be good, and then we don't call them addicts. If they pour it into some kind of career, we call them high achievers of some kind. It just depends on what they channel it into. So, I think, some people are kind of all in on things or not. I don't know that I would necessarily call that an addictive personality. But you have a point.
Well, let me just ask before we get into the main topic here. Looking over your website and online a little bit about you, you seem to not be big on things like Alcoholics Anonymous. My brother-in-law, who I just mentioned, used to say that he found them to be worthless because a lot of the people after each meeting would go across the street to the bar and have a couple of brewskis. So do you think that groups like Alcoholics Anonymous or other such approaches generally reinforce that because they are trying to bring a group of people into face a problem when every person is going to have their own way of doing things? So is it trying to like shoehorn a problem and make it everyone has the same solution when that's not the case?
Yeah, I think so. I think you're dead on with that. And their solution to the problem is a little strange, because it's go through a sort of religious transformation, right? And that's what it is. And you go in there and they want you to, if you start going to meetings, you'll notice everybody starts telling the same basic story where their drinking or their drug use was always extreme and the worst kind of substance use ever from the moment they started. And their life before they found AA was all shit. And then they did the steps and they were saved. And now it's a daily struggle. And they sort of relish in this identity of the addict or the alcoholic, that they're different from other people and they're fragile. All of this stuff that gets taught, it's, some people say it's like another addiction, which would go to your addictive personality idea, right?
Yeah.
Because, they just become consumed with fighting alcoholism or fighting addiction. And in many cases, it takes up more of their life than sometimes a drug or alcohol use did. I've gotten complaints of that from parents that, their daughter is ignoring her family and her kids because she's now just on AA calls all the time and at AA meetings all the time. What the group does that I think is very harmful is they get everybody to get up and say, I am an addict. My name is Steve, I am an addict. Or, my name is Steve, I am an alcoholic. And you believe that this is a stable part of you. There's some weakness in you. There's something that's always pushing you to want to drink, and you're never going to be able to control yourself. And as long as I was involved in those 12-step groups, that was how I felt. When I stopped being involved, I stopped feeling that way, and I moved beyond it. That identity is horrible. There's no reason for it. People get over these problems. It's the norm to get over it and to move on, and yet they make it into a lifelong thing, and it's actually pretty sad.
Well, let me just read a little definition of what a disease is here that I got from online. And it says here, and I just Googled it, and it's from a typical online dictionary.com kind of website. It says, disease, noun, a disorder of structure or function in a human, animal, or plant, especially one that produces specific signs or symptoms or that affects a specific location and is not simply a direct result of physical injury. So, looking at that, I'm just wondering how the CDC and all of these medical groups could possibly consider addiction a disease on par with cancer, hardening of the arteries, Alzheimer's, etc., and so forth. It seems to me that the only way that an addiction could possibly be defined as a disease is if some kind of bacteria somehow controlled the mind and forced you to go to your buyer and buy some drugs, or go to a prostitute so you can indulge your sex addiction, or forced you to go down to the local deli and get a six-pack and drink. So where do we get this stretching of the definition from what seems a fairly reasonable, and most people consent to the idea that that definition of disease is pretty accurate, to having these medical groups suddenly, bizarrely like Play-Doh, stretch the definition?
Yeah, well, they have a history of stretching the definition of disease. You know, homosexuality was a disease until the early 70s. There's plenty more weird diseases through history. Almost any behavior that people disapprove of has been called a disease of some kind. And, you know, I think it's partly because at one point you only had your priest or your doctor to go to about problems. And maybe because people are moving away from going to their priests, they're going to the doctors. So it's, you know, I'm not sure. And I'm not religious myself, so I'm not saying we need more priests. But the point being that, you know, we want people to fix anything that's wrong about us now. And parents, you know, here's a quote I saw the other day, and it was some parents that are activists against the opioid epidemic. Their daughter was a heroin user, and she'd been through a bunch of rehabs, and had recently sobered up and been sober for a while, been, you know, in recovery through the whole normal thing, going to meetings and rehab and all that. And they interviewed the parents, and the mother was saying, well, I know people are going to look at my husband and I and think that we're bad parents, but we're not. She had a disease. And that's comforting to those parents. It lets them off the hook of the idea that maybe they did something wrong. And I don't think addiction comes about because parents did something wrong, but that's their belief. And the disease model lets them off the hook for that. It explains a lot. It's convenient. So even though it doesn't make sense, we all sort of buy into it. The other things that it does functionally is it allows a family to come in, and instead of saying, hey, the way you're living is stupid, and you need to stop it, which, you know, that's just saying, hey, I order you to stop. Instead of saying that, then come in like they do on the TV show Intervention and say, won't you please accept the gift of treatment? So now they're not telling you what to do. They're saying you have a disease, and we're going to help you get treatment for it. It allows them to frame that in a whole different way. And then people with drug use problems, they like the disease model too, because if you want to keep using drugs or alcohol, right, and you've now ascribed to this disease model, whenever you use, you get to say, I'm sorry, I relapsed. Somebody triggered me. This bad thing happened. It triggered me. It made me relapse. You know, being in recovery is really hard. It's a lifelong, incurable disease. Can relapse at any moment. And so they get to say these things. And it's our society screwed up way of dealing with other people's behavior. There's this impulse to control each other. So we use shiesty little ways of doing that, like saying you have a disease, and using that to control people. And then because all of this anti-drug control was out there, the people that we're trying to control use it back. You know, they'll use it back all day long. Yeah, I got a disease. That's why I'm doing it. So lay off me. Yeah. You get it? You get how it sort of sustains?
Yeah. Well, we've talked about alcohol and drugs. How about people who claim to be quote-unquote sex addicts? You know, I can't help, I need to, shoot my load every 24 hours. So I go to prostitutes, or I'm a gambler. And every time I have to go to the track and bet on the ponies, or I have to bet on the latest basketball game. Uh, Even if let's just say, even if we were to say that the current idea that shooting drugs or ingesting alcohol could possibly affect you because that's a physical substance upon you, how in the world could you explain sexual addiction, supposedly, or gambling addiction in those same terms as you could alcohol or drugs, since nothing is being put into the body?
Yeah, and how could you explain shopping addiction too, right? Things like that.
Yeah.
Somebody who's really sophisticated will tell you that those activities, they stimulate the same part of the brain, the pleasure center, as drugs and alcohol do. And so they'll say that's what it's all about, and it's a brain disease. But people can stop, and they do stop all the time. And if they don't stop, it's because they don't really want to. And I know that's, like, let's say a guy does keep getting arrested for picking up prostitutes or something like that. It's like, well, why doesn't he stop? He keeps getting arrested. Well, because he thinks it's worth the risk. That's all there is to it, Why didn't I stop when I kept getting arrested for heroin and going homeless and all these things? Because I thought the feeling I was going to get from the heroin was worth all of that stuff. I didn't want those things to happen, but I was willing to pay that price. And I think that's what's going on with all of these so-called addictions. But the problem is people only have one or two ways to think about behaviors that are looked down upon. And that is either it's a sin or it's a disease. And nobody wants to be a sinner. So it's easier to say, yeah, I got this addiction thing. I don't know, I can't stop. But in fact, they can. Like there's this guy, Carl Hart, neuroscientist. He got into neuroscience to explain, to try to figure out why crack ruined the neighborhood that he grew up in, which was a bad neighborhood in Miami. And he thought he was going to find the answers. He studied the effects of drugs on animals, on their brains, and eventually on humans. And he said, these drugs aren't, addictive. People can stop doing them. They don't change your brain forever. They make things happen in the brain. Anything that we do does. But he did these behavioral studies where he brought crack users who were, fit the diagnosis for addiction, right? And, you were around in the 80s, right? We grew up on all the crack movies. Remember? Can you think of any?
Well, I remember when black kids did what was later called crack in the late 60s and 70s, was called pop in the 70s. They only came up with the term crack in the 80s when suburban white kids did it, because crack is a scarier word than pop. But
okay, I didn't even know the word pop. That's awesome. Yeah, so, but then we had, in the 80s, we had this scare about the crack that as soon as you smoke some, you turn into Chris Rock in New Jack City, and you just keep going like a zombie, and you will do anything. You will screw anybody over to just keep getting crack, and you cannot stop. So what Carl Hart did is he brought crack addicts into the lab, gave them crack, a big old hit of crack, said, do you want another hit, or do you want money that's going to go into your account for being in the study? They're getting paid to be in the study, right? But do you want $10 that's going to go in your account that you get 2 weeks from now? You don't walk out the door with it today, And so the reason that's important to remember is because the crack user supposedly can't think of long-term wants. He can only think about right now. And as they adjusted the amount of money and values from $20. You got it to a point where almost all of the time at $20, they would choose the $20 instead of more crack.
Mm.
And he did experiments like that with methamphetamine as well. And what he showed is people are choosing. If they see if they believe they have a better reward, they will choose not to have the crack. And that's kind of the whole thing right there with addiction. When people believe they have a better option, they take it. People who believe they're addicted, whatever it is to do, like, I need to go, put money down on this roulette table right now. They think that's going to be the best and fun way for them to spend their time right now. That's all there is to it.
Well, I want to broaden out to a bit more social ideas and consequences. I want to use a term that I'm kind of loath to use, because I know a lot of times a term like calling something an industry is pejorative. For example, people who are against abortion rights will call Planned Parenthood an industry that's exploiting women, which I think is bullshit. But the point is, do you think that it's more profitable for certain people, certain groups, certain colleges, universities, to propagate the idea of addiction as a disease? And if so, why and how did that get started? I.e., that if we went back to a little bit, at least, to the idea that people are responsible for their own actions, there would be a lot less money available for people to get behind. And I'm not saying that these people are willfully doing it, that they're willfully trying to snook at people for their own benefit, but it's just one of those things that sometimes things just stumble into something and something takes on a force of its own. What is your take on that kind of an idea?
I wholeheartedly agree with you. There's some bad actors in the rehab industry, but they're very few and they're capitalizing in some very specific ways. But first of all the counselors I had, I could tell they were sincere people who really believed what they were telling me. I really believed they were going to save my life by telling me I could never change. So I agree with you. I think we're at a historical accident here, is why we've gotten to a place where we've got this completely dysfunctional addiction treatment system with this disease idea that keeps failing to be proven by science. All of this points against it again and again and again and again. But we're all invested in it because we think it's the only way to help. And really, we're in a space where we're being told it's the only politically correct thing to do is to say that heavy drug user is a victim of a disease. If you're to say that they are in control of themselves and can change, then you're apparently a bad guy, judgmental person. People have pushed this idea because they really believe in it. So yeah, I agree with you.
Let me just pick up on the idea of political correctness, and that's another social thing that I think had good intentions, but has gone awry over the last 30 or so years. George Carlin, the late comedian, once said something along the lines that political correctness is fascism hiding as politeness. And I'm wondering if political correctness and other ideas that promote this idea that we don't have responsibility, we don't have free will. I've done some shows on free will. We'll be doing another one hopefully soon. People, if you look on Twitter or any social media, they'll talk about how they don't have a responsibility. People don't want to take responsibility about the things they say. They hide behind their Twitter things. There's something called the mask effect. When people don't know who you are, or if you're a Klansman wearing a mask literally, or you're hiding behind a Twitter account, you act in ways that you wouldn't normally if people knew that you were Stephen Slate. So do you think that this, however it's gotten to this state, this idea that we're not responsible, that we have no free will, as some people say, postmodernism says this, Political correctness to a certain degree agrees with some aspects of that. Do you think that that's the larger issue rather than addiction, and that addiction and addiction being a disease is just a subset of this larger ethos that we're somehow just puppets to
Yeah.
some, grand
I,
puppeteer?
I absolutely agree with you. It's the larger issue. So years ago, when I started to write my own work, I was trying to come up with my own book on addiction. I sat in the library just getting all the research that I could and everything, and looking into this, tearing apart the whole issue. What I came up with is people's belief in determinism is probably the worst thing going. You know, I don't think a lot of people would articulate that they believe in determinism, but they, we see everybody talking about the causes of addiction, right? And we hear things like that. The poverty in the Rust Belt is the cause of addiction. Everybody jumps on board with that. Yeah. We don't want to think that people are freely choosing to use drugs because they don't have jobs that they're doing it, or whatever. Everybody wants to get on with the idea that there's something causing this outside of the individual, and that people can't bring themselves back from it, change in some way. So I think free will is a big issue. In fact, in Freedom Model for Addictions, Escape the Treatment Recovery Trap. That's a book that I wrote with Mark Sheeran and Michelle Dunbar at my colleagues at the Freedom Model Retreats. We put a chapter on free will in the book. Put a chapter called Causes versus Reasons, to get people to really analyze, like, whoa, what do you really think is going on? Talk about this, that, or the other thing causes me to use drugs. Are you a helpless pawn being pushed around by those things? Or do you have free will? And we got into some of the philosophical weeds with that as well. I'm a big believer in free will, and I think you either have it or you don't. And the whole addiction debate takes a weird stance on it because it's very deterministic in a lot of ways. When they say addiction robs you of free will, so they sort of think you have it, but then you don't after you do drugs. It's all very vague, and you're right. Like postmodernism, all of this like logical positivism and everything is like a lot of the people that are in the universities, in the sciences, that are doing the research, they've kind of taken that for granted, some idea that, it's kind of an illusion. And they just operate on that. They kind of ignore the idea that people have free will. It's kind of like, well, that's not really a thing because I can't put free will in a test tube and see it, right?
Well, do you think that a better model for arguing what addiction is not disease, but to use crime? And putting aside the idea that we've criminalized a lot of addictive behaviors, I mean it in this sense. If you look worldwide throughout history, the biggest predictor of crime is poverty. So if you have a lot of poor people, you're going to have more crime. And the hypothesis behind that, of course, is that if people don't have the means to live in a decent fashion, they're going to do what they need to get to it. Now, that doesn't rob the would-be criminal of free will. If I have 2 kids that I have to feed, there's a famous movie called The Bicycle Thief. I don't know if you've ever seen that. You have seen it. Yeah, the father is driven to steal a bicycle after his bicycle is stolen. And so the idea is that crime is a good predictor, but again, that doesn't relieve the individual criminal of their personal responsibility. Do you think that's a better model to approach than the disease model regarding addiction?
So sort of like what exactly are you saying? So I got you. So in some circumstances, that drug and alcohol use is going to look more attractive in some situations, right? Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, in that there are going to be people, if we accept that poverty is the putative cause of crime, I mean, putting aside the free will argument, we could say that unhappiness, depression, you know, the state that people are in. My girlfriend dumped me. I just got demoted. My favorite team lost the Super Bowl or whatnot, and now I'm going to shoot up, kind of thing. That we could say that just as poverty is the putative cause of crime in the main, not relieving the individual responsibility, that a negative depressive state is the putative cause of addictions, because we want to bet on the horse that on the horse. We want to look at the porno or whatnot. We want to shoot drugs into our systems, or we want to go out and just get plastered. Would that be a similar model, do you think?
Yeah, I think it sort of is. I'm careful with those kind of things when I talk to somebody who has a problem, because I don't want to ever make them feel forced to do it by circumstances. But, I agree with you. In a certain age and time and place, it seems like the best option available is to do these things, And so I get what you're saying, sort of like in a soft sense. Like when the temperature goes up, more people are going to go to the beach. But whether or not you decide to go to the beach that day is still totally within your control, right?
Yeah. And how about the idea too that if these people are depressed and whatnot, the addictive behaviors are their way of feeling better, but also that if we say that it is a disease, that's another little boost to make us feel better, because we're not a bad person. We're not someone who's making a choice. We're relieved of responsibility. That again, I would have to be a logical consequence, or the thing that we'd have to state is the likeliest reason why we want to call it a disease. No?
Yeah, because it gets us off the hook in a way.
Yeah,
absolutely. Some would say that's eerily similar to what a drug use choice is. It makes you feel good right now, but at what cost down the line, right? And when you're giving up your freedom and beating yourself down and believing that you're not free to change, that's a heavy cost that comes at you. And I've been there,
Well, let me just ask then, aside from your own struggles, and you said you wrote a book, what is the main purpose of your website, the Clean Slate Addiction site?
I mean, the main purpose originally when I put it up was to get my writing in front of people. Because I've been writing sort of in isolation for years and years and years and needed to get it in front of people. But what I wanted to present is another side of the story. And I'm not the only one to present it. I know that you know about guys like Stan Peele, Gene Heyman. There's a guy, Jeff Shaler, who wrote a really great book called Addiction is a Choice. There's been people saying this stuff forever, and I wanted to say it too in my own way and from my own experience relating into it a little bit as well. I want people, so one of the things that you'll find I push the most on my website is just the fact that most people get over their drug problems. Because when you go to rehab, they tell you that you are doomed. And everybody tells you you can't quit without rehab. But the fact is that over 90% of people with alcohol problems will get over those problems at some point. And for 96% of people with other drug problems will get over those problems at some point. And only about 20 or 25% of them will ever get treatment. And only a slightly higher percentage will ever go to a support group, maybe not go to treatment. It's a very small, it's only a fraction of people get help, but most people do get over this. Get over it by choice, by moving on and getting bored and saying, I want more than this, better than this. And that's what I want people to know, because there was nowhere I was finding that message when I had a problem, except for when I went to St. Jude Retreat. And they said, yeah, you can get over this. Most people do. Nobody told me that. They just tell you you're going to be doomed when you go to rehab.
So how do you change the paradigm? It would seem to me that simply trying to work from within the rehab industry, or whatever you want to call it, is not going to be as effective. It's something that's going to have to come sort of organically, I think, throughout all of society, because as we earlier said, it isn't just about addiction. It's this whole idea that we are acted upon rather than actors within the universe.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we change that paradigm?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I know I'm trying to do my part to change it in regard to addiction. Put out that book, The Freedom Model, and what we did in it is so radical, and we're getting a great response to it. And I think right now people only have one answer about heavy drug use, and that is that it's a disease. And when you have somebody that's having a problem in your life, you need a framework by which to help them. And what we have now is treatment. But most people know that that's wrong and that it's weird. My mother went to Al-Anon meetings, which is for the families of drug and alcohol users, and she was creeped out by it. She had friends that went to it, and they brought her, and they said, you got to do it. And she just was like, this isn't right. This is dumb. Can't do this. A lot of people know that it doesn't ring right with them that this is a disease, but they have no other framework by which to help people and by which to understand the problem, so they continue along with it. So what I'm trying to do is get this book in as many hands as possible, and it says, it's kind of a big book. It's 480 pages. It's written as self-help for the person with a problem. Others can read it, and they can learn a lot, but it is written as self-help to the person struggling. It's not like a book for the academic crowd, but it is loaded up with research, and it gives all of the facts to drug and alcohol users. And it says, basically, it is your choice. Now that we've given you the facts and a way to analyze your options, you go make your decisions. You don't need treatment. You don't need to adjust the world around you so that it doesn't trigger you. It doesn't matter if you're employed, unemployed, happily married, not anything. If you stop thinking drugs are the solution, you can quit them. Or you can moderate them, by the way. That's something nobody wants anyone to know. But half of get over their alcohol use problems, become moderate drinkers. Other people get over drug problems, become moderate drinkers, or some of them use a safer drug like marijuana or something like that. It's all possible, but nobody wants people to know that, because we want to hold on to sort of scaring people sober. So I don't know how to change the whole culture, except that I can put my piece out there with this book and hopefully change some minds. And when people have something they grasp onto that really gives them a solution and a way of understanding this, then they can let go of the old way.
Well, I will link to the Clean Slate, the cleanslate.org below this video. So let me just ask finally a two-part question. Look out 10, 12 years to maybe the year 2030. Number one, what do you think that you will be doing then? And number two, where do you think the state of the country or the medical industry will be in regards to this idea of addiction as a disease? Do you think that momentum is growing, a pushback against this, or what? So personally, and then also in the larger sense, where do you see 10, 12 years down the line being?
There is momentum. I've seen a lot of momentum since I've been in this, and I think the internet has really helped. Nobody knew there was any alternatives to AA back in the 90s. I mean, there was rational recovery, which was a method. There were some other things, but nobody knew about them. And then with the explosion of the internet, people started to find out about all of this stuff. It's amazing there's still people out there who think that 12-step and rehab way is the only way. We've now splintered, and people are trying to come up with all these different models of treatment. I want to lead the way to not treatment. So I see myself growing with an educational program, and less of that educational program being about freeing people from the trap. Because if you look at my book now, about half of it is about getting out of the addicted mindset that we are taught by rehabs and the treatment industry and all of that. Half of it is that, and half of it is about the decision-making process and how to really make that happen. Mm-hmm. I hopefully see in 10 to 12 years, instead of half and half, it's only, maybe 10% getting out of the disease mindset, and the rest of it is, here's how you operationalize making a new choice, figuring what you want. That's where I see us going, and I think there's rapid change happening right now. I don't know what way it's going to go at all in this industry, but it's blowing up. As everybody knows, it's not working. We have more treatment than ever. It was a few $1 billion a year spent on it in like the year 2000, and now we spend $35 billion a year, and we have 64,000 drug deaths of some kind, and that's not all opioids. Also, that's about 42,000 opioids, and the other 12,000 is other drugs. Meth and cocaine are big too that people are dying of. So we have more treatment, we have more people dying, and I think that's starting to hit people like a ton of bricks, and there's going to be some kind of shakeup. I just don't know what it is.
Well, I want to thank you for spending an hour or so speaking with me about this, and as I said, I will link to your website below this video. Anyone who wants to find out more about your ideas or contact you can do so. So thanks a lot, Stephen Slate.
Thanks so much, Dan.